In this section, we're going to talk about three helpful concepts I think that are more broadly known in Eastern ideas and mythology, and then would be really helpful for us in our modern lives here in the Western world. So the first one is Wu Wei, and you can see lots of translations, but I actually really like the way Alan Watts discusses it, where he talks about it really being not forcing things. In my mindful community, we talk about letting go and how everything about modern life makes us kind of control freaks, or makes us think that our happiness depends on gaining more and more control over our life, when actually the opposite may be true. And that's only continue to accelerate as you can have food delivered to your house, groceries delivered. We just have so much more control over our lives than people did 100 years ago. We think it will make us happier and happier, when that may not necessarily be true. If you were to look it up in Google, so there are lots of definitions that kind of say not doing, not acting, not trying. But the way Alan Watts kind of says is not to force things. We'll talk through in a little bit. So it's kind of the idea of, if a lock is stuck, you don't try to force the key into the lock, because you either bend the key or break the lock, but you kind of jiggle it. You don't force it to happen, you just kind of work with it. It's an idea of, there's to work within the accordance of the pattern of things as they are, so you don't add interference. This kind of gets into some ideas of like synchronicity and spontaneity, which are also very popular in mindfulness, and how you get into flow with nature and the world around you. One way to do that is to understand, we'll talk in a minute, you may not understand all of the systems and relations between things, but once you kind of get the idea of how to act in accordance with the pattern of things, then you don't add any external interference, or even, as Abraham Hicks would kind of call, your own personal resistance to any kind of situation. So this would get into ideas of, there are cooperative interdependencies, things that we would look at like bees and flowers and how they help each other. And there are others we'd say might be more competitive, like birds and worms and so forth. But what we don't understand is if we don't look at the big picture and the whole system of nature and the world, which can be very complex and how it goes together, then we may not fully understand how all the interrelations work. So therefore, our desire to add control to this situation may actually just add interference and resistance that may help it work against us rather than help us achieve our goals. So it's this idea of the friendly enemy or the necessary adversary in terms of like birds and worms, and that would get to the idea of like wolves. There are some policies from certain states and certain national parks to kind of eradicate wolves, because they thought that would help the land flourish if you got rid of some of the apex predators that kind of stalk deer and whatever the case may be. And now over the last few years or last decade or so, you've seen a reintroduction of wolves into the wild in those areas. And as long as those populations don't get out of control, they've actually found that the wolves are really a beneficial factor. And, yes, there is some competitiveness among with the deer populations and so forth, but when you look at the whole system, rather than just say, oh, we don't want these wolves here because the wolves may attack the sick or weaker deer, and that may then impact many different things. But when you look at the whole ecosystem, which is kind of what they did, and they learned that having wolves there actually makes everything healthier, because there isn't as much scarcity of resources, there isn't as much competition for those resources, and things that you wouldn't even expect wolves to impact were all much better. So deer populations were healthier, the land, the types of animals and so forth, everything got much healthier in the ecosystem. So that's another example where if we literally tried to force our opinions of control that we thought would make the situation better, which is let's reduce the populations or eradicate the wolves, and in reality we actually made the situation worse because we didn't understand all the intricacies or interdependencies of the relations. Whereas if we try not to force our own opinions or agenda into the situation, then we allow nature and this natural kind of letting go, spontaneity, synchronicity, working with the accordance of things, allow us to work a little bit more freely and a little bit more easily. So I do love the idea of Wu Wei, kind of saying, it's almost, I can think of it as like a, not necessarily go with the flow, almost the, find the path of least resistance, but it's kind of working together with things to try to find synchronicity rather than trying to believe that if you just control the situation and get your way, that your way is going to make you happy. So here we go, is Li. And the idea of Li is kind of takes the next step beyond Wu Wei, which kind of talks to more about that ecosystem which we don't fully understand. And it kind of talks about like organic patterns. You'll see some definitions if you were to Google it, or some translations of Li would be as reason or stuff like that, but those aren't very great definitions. Again, I like to take Alan Watts' wisdom on this one, where it kind of talks about natural patterns, organic patterns, like the grain of wood or the markings in jade. It's when you look at big rock formations or even vegetation, fields and so forth, when you look at it, you wouldn't describe it as a mess, so it is orderly, so it has some order to it, but it's not immediately in obvious order. We like to simplify things to very neat squares or boxes or simple ideas or simple equations, and that's not the way the world or nature works. And so if we try to apply very rudimentary, simplistic models to things, we may not get the whole picture between it, just as we kind of talked about with Wu Wei. And so what this kind of gets to is if you were to look at the markings of jade or really patterns of really the grain of wood, you kind of see that it's definitely something different than a mess. So you wouldn't say this is total chaos and just randomly haphazardly thrown together. But in the same way, you can't say I can't get my arms around, I can't wrap my mind around what the exact pattern is. So you can't really get the idea of it all at once. And that's kind of this idea of, again, the interdependence and complexity of systems with ourselves and other people, ourselves and society, ourselves and the environment are so complicated and interrelated that there's no way for us to quickly see or quickly take a look at it and assess it and determine a kind of pattern or a way of making obvious sense about it. It's the same way kind of when you look at the way things are taught these days. Nature has a certain amount of creativity to it, and that creativity of how it lays out rocks and trees and interdependence between animals and the land and so forth, that it's so intricate. But these days, all the schools try to teach our kids and students to be super creative. That's kind of the big thing today, is they have courses on how to be creative. But one of the things I think I learned from mindfulness and some of these Eastern ideas is if creativity were able to be something that were so simple that we had a quick pattern we could write down, hand it to children, and teach them how to be perfectly creative, then it would have no value to us. So why we appreciate creativity is because it is very complex. It's not something we can pin down immediately and almost pass off to other people, and that's why we appreciate creative arts and creative paintings and so forth. So if, with something that Alan Watts likes to say, something that's always essential in the creative is the mysterious. So it may not look like a pattern right now, but that's why certain musics and songs and jazz, you don't know where it's going to go, and that's why all the creativity comes in, because it's like, well, how did they do that? When you look at certain paintings, if you look at a painting for long enough, you're like, it's a very creative way of painting, whether it's the Impressionists and in early France and stuff like that. All these things are just so creative that if you were to chop it down to a structure, I can tell you myself, I'm not a creative artistic person with a scientific background. So if I were to be a painter, I would never know when to finish a painting, because I would never know when it's done, because I would always look at it and say, oh, I can kind of tweak a little bit here, tweak a little bit there. When in reality, if you just kind of let go and trust the creative process and kind of look at this organic, pattern that you've created for it, you can trust that it doesn't have to be perfect and all the edges be refined and chopped into a box where everything's square. But that's where you kind of create this effect of Li, which is your paintings have a pattern to them. That's why you can kind of tell the same artists between different paintings, because even though the paintings and the subjects may be so different, you kind of see this broad pattern emerge from them. Same thing with if you watch enough movies or TVs, you can say, I think I know this writer or this director because there's just a certain feel that comes from it. I can't explain to you, the details that would make a Steven Spielberg movie, but if you've seen enough of them, you could probably make a guess on a random movie as to whether or not it is one of his movies. That's kind of this idea of Lee, where there's a broader, larger organic pattern that we may not fully understand, and that's okay, as long as we can try to work together with it. And then the last concept we'll talk in this section is one I also find most helpful. Is actually what I talk about last in my mindful community is Yugen, which is kind of a Japanese term, which is, as this one states, I looked around some definitions of an awareness of the universe that triggers an emotional response too deep and powerful for words. Another one that I found is kind of a profound, mysterious sense of beauty in the universe, and at the same time, the sad beauty of human suffering. And so it is a tremendous sense of awe, but at the same time, almost a little bit of melancholy. So in my mindful community, I build things up to eventually put a lot of these concepts together to tell you what I believe to be my interpretation of what is the secret to life. And I actually don't end there. I actually continue on and say, okay, the secret of life is not the end. You then need to go into kind of Yugen to understand it. So if you understand like peaks and valleys of life, Yugen is really the valley aspect of life. So this is where we gain wisdom, we have some self-reflection, some that can come from looking at hard times. Like no one is going to be super successful if everything you ever touch and everything you do in life is successful the first time. You will never learn and never gain the experience you need. But if you do have some ups and downs and some hardships and some setbacks, that's where you gain wisdom, that's where you learn, and then that valley aspect of Yugen is what's going to help you as you try to move your life forward or make progress towards where you want to go. So some of the best stories of Yugen, or some ideas that give you an idea, because this is one of the most elusive definitions, so this can't be covered on just an Intro 101. That's why we kind of spend one of our whole months on the idea of Yugen in the mindful community, but it's some would describe it as watching birds, a flock of birds flying and then see them disappear behind the clouds. It elicits a feeling of Yugen because you wonder where they went. Will they pop out? Another one might be to see ships sailing on the horizon and see their masts disappear behind the island. So it's kind of a sense of the mystery of where did they go. Also at the same time, almost this fear of missing out kind of aspect where it's a mystery and you kind of leave it and you don't solve it. So it's this idea that comes out of kind of some Schwann terms as well. That's kind of like the deep and the dark, or the deep and the mysterious kind of concepts. And so one of the best ways I would say in modern take to try to talk about this is talking about like on New Year's Eve. Let's say you're single and you're going to a New Year's Eve party, and it's midnight, and maybe it's a masquerade party, and everyone's dressed up in masks and costumes, whatever the case may be. And at midnight, you're by yourself. A beautiful stranger comes up and kisses you, and it's this wonderful, romantic, passionate kiss. And then they kind of disappear into the crowd. And that's why I talk about a lot in our mindful community. Is there are so many aspects of our society or things that have come to us that are not beneficial to us or no longer serve us, and we need to unlearn those. That's why I say lots of things need to be unlearned, and one of those would be is everything from Hollywood or every movie would teach us what you should immediately do. You have a choice in that moment. You can let that stranger disappear, and then always have this romantic notion of New Year's Eve parties, and wondering what's that person doing, why do they love me, could we have been together, could we have had this life. It creates all these strings of mysteries that are both wonderful and amazing at the same time, but also kind of a sad FOMO, melancholy aspect, because you're like, oh, what could have been, right? And what we are taught is to destroy all mysteries and kind of get to the bottom of everything. So if this were to be, the other option would be is you go down and you chase down that person and you say, no, that was wonderful, we should start dating or live together, or whatever the case may be. And sure enough, odds are statistically over time that when you do that, you're probably going to realize that you two aren't compatible, or this relationship kind of mirrors some of your past unsuccessful relationships, or it's just not something you want. And by doing so, as we talked about like time scale, you actually destroy the memories and the meaning and the emotions attached to the moment you had on New Year's Eve. So what Yugen kind of says is some mysteries are just meant to be mysteries, and the fact that you get so much a positive emotion out of it with the sadness at the same time actually enhances that kind of mystery and the feeling and the emotion that you have. And so their advice would be is to if something like that magically happens to you, just let it go and let it be a mystery. And it's as hard for us to understand or believe as that will serve you better on your journey and motivate you more than trying to chase down every single mystery or every single possible opportunity only to find that it isn't what you wanted, if that makes sense. So it's a very complicated subject, but I think one that's at least worth touching upon in this, because it is such a profound meaning and depth, and I think we are not taught anything close to this, and that's the ideas can be very powerful. So it's again this awareness of the universe that triggers deep emotions, whether that's what are those people doing over there, or what if this happened, or what's the mystery behind this wonderful moment that just happened, that triggers emotional responses too deep or powerful for words.